Good morning, everyone. Myself, Vivek Bombale, Assistant Professor, Department of ISC, Sahitya Future Technology, Rajankote, Bangalore. Today we are going to see the concept of weak entity type. Weak entity type. What is the entity? Entity is an object which a physical existence, or entity is an object which an conceptual existence. Entity, physical existence, something but a person, or a vehicle, anything. Conceptual, like company, university, these are the conceptual entity. Entity type. So weak entity type, we have a strong entity type and the weak entity type. The strong entity type, nothing but entity which having a key attribute of their own, we say it as a strong entity type. The entity which having a key attribute of their own, for example, means that entity have their primary key. It's having its own primary key, right? Whichever the table, whichever the entity which having its own primary key, those type of entity we say it as a strong entity. Example, just take a student table, student entity, student ID. Student ID is the primary key for the table student. So student ID, why we consider it as a primary key? What is the main constraint? What is the main rule to find a primary key? The primary key means if you want to make that particular attribute as a primary key means it should satisfy two conditions. First condition, it should be unique. Whatever the values we are giving to that attribute, the all values should be unique. No repeated values. No repeated values we should give to that attribute. Second set condition is what? It should not take a null value. For if we make any attribute as a primary key, we cannot put null value to that attribute. If those two conditions satisfies that attribute, we can make it as a primary key. So if any of the entity which having attribute like primary key, that type of entity we say it as a strong entity. So just reverse vice versa of that strong entity is weak entity. An entity type that do not have key attribute of their own, we say it as a weak entity type. Means it doesn't have its own primary key. Right? That weak entity is depending upon the other entity, that is strong entity, depending upon the primary key of the other entity, that is strong entity. Such entity we say it as a weak entity type. So I will repeat, entity type that does not have key attribute of their own, we say it as a weak entity type. It is depending upon the other entity, the strong entity attributes. Right? This is a weak entity type. One example here, student has student ID as primary key, as explained now. So example here, customer, this is a customer, then borrows loan. Customer borrows loan. This is the strong entity and loan is the weak entity, right? So why we consider loan has a weak entity means if the customer has not borrowed any loan from the bank, if customer not borrowed any loan from the bank, then we don't need this loan entity is not required. Okay, when this loan entity will exist, only when any of the customer has borrowed this loan from the bank, then only this entity is exist. And this weak entity will always have a partial, will have a partial key. It doesn't have any primary key. So this primary, this for this weak entity, what is the primary key? It will borrow from the strong entity, that is customer table. It is customer ID. So this becomes the customer ID. This ID becomes the primary key for the weak entity type, right? And double rhombus symbol identifies the relationship between the weak entity and the strong entity. This ER diagram notation served and all we're going to see in the next video, right? So for weak entity, we're going to give in the double rectangular notation, and this is a strong entity type, and this is the primary key, right? And for relationship between the weak entity and the strong entity, we're going to show in the identifying relationship. We say it as identifying relationship, that is double rhombus symbol. This is regarding the